Hey, what's up guys? Today we have to talk about Faruzan, the newest 4-star in Genshin, who's currently featured alongside Wander and Ito on their respective banners. In today's video, there are two things that I want to accomplish. First of all, I want to talk about Faruzan, my problems with her character and her kit, as design-wise, I believe she has something that we haven't really seen before, which is quite annoying, and so I want to address that and talk about how strong I believe she is, if you should use her, and my thoughts on the character. And in the second part of the video, I will be covering the more standard guide stuff regarding how to get the most value out of your Faruzan, regarding her best artifacts, weapons, teams, and all that stuff. This is therefore going to be a complete video dissecting Faruzan and my thoughts on her, while also giving you guys the best build advice possible for this character. Now, as always, before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. And with that being said, let's get into it. Alright, so starting things off, let's actually talk about Faruzan, what she does, and why it's sort of problematic. Now, do keep in mind that while I am on my main account right now on the live servers, I did also get to use her on the media server where I fully leveled her and her talents, in case that is something you're wondering. Now, starting things off, what does Faruzan actually do? Well, she's an Anemo support whose entire purpose is to buff the damage of your other Anemo carry, generally speaking. What I mean by that is the central part of her kit is her elemental burst, which will deal a bit of Anemo damage, but also, and especially, decreasing the Anemo resistance of enemies, and also giving your party members an Anemo damage bonus throughout the duration of your burst. Because of that, you will be buffing your entire team's Anemo damage in two different ways, by the bonus percentage here, and also by decreasing the resistance, which is very relevant. If that wasn't enough, you also have a passive talent right here that will increase the damage of your characters that deal Anemo damage by a percentage of your Faruzan's base attack. And so as we can see, her base kit has three different ways of increasing your Anemo damage, or effectively supporting an Anemo DPS like Wander or Shoutout. Because of that, as a kit, she's naturally going to be appealing with those Anemo DPS characters and someone who you naturally want to pair with them. Where I do have a problem with Faruzan though is regarding her energy generation, her grouping capabilities, and especially her dependence on constellations. To break things down one by one, let's start by talking about her elemental skill. Her elemental skill is an ability that you use. It places this thing on the ground, does a bit of damage and stuff, but it's when you do a charge shot that you can charge a bit faster through this effect, that you'll channel a little vortex on the ground that has a small bit of grouping capabilities while also generating some Anemo particles for you. Now, do keep in mind, you're only getting 2 Anemo particles, which is a very small amount, and the grouping, while it isn't terrible, is only like one instance of grouping. Like, as you can see, it kind of groups the characters together, and then that's it. It's done. You swap out, you use other support abilities, you go to your main DPS, whatever, and they're already ungrouped, generally speaking. So it's definitely not a good form of grouping when compared to other Anemo characters like Venti, Kazuha, or even Sucrose. Now, if her only problem was a lack of grouping, then she would still be a great character. Her burst is the main part of your kit that you're using to buff your Anemo DPS, and honestly, it is good enough to where I still usually recommend using it with someone like the Wanderer, even at C0, because generally speaking, it's still a nice buff. Now, with that said, there is a big problem here. What that problem is that this burst has an 80 energy cost, and as we saw, her elemental skill not only will only generate 2 Anemo particles, but also only generates those particles on your charge shot. In fact, if you press your skill and swap, you're not generating particles. You actually have to do that charge shot, which takes time, can get interrupted, and honestly will not be doing much damage at all at C0 given how much energy recharge you need. In fact, since you're only generating 2 Anemo particles, with your skill, you are going to need an ungodly amount of energy recharge, and I normally give wide energy recharge ranges in my videos, because if you play perfectly, if you run Favonius supports, if you know what you're doing, you can run less energy recharge and get away with a lot less than some other players might. But with Faruzan specifically, it's such a high amount that I honestly think a lot of people might not even have enough ER pieces on their account to be able to play this character at C0 and actually get their burst back on cooldown. In fact, the exact amount of energy recharge you need, while it does vary, is ungodly. It's usually around 250 to 300, unless you're doing other things like running 3 Anemo characters or a ton of Favonius supports on your team, which are all viable strategies, but something that, in my opinion, shouldn't be a thing. You shouldn't be forced to run 4 characters that give your 1 support energy just to be able to buff your team's damage. Now, again, it is manageable, and you can play Faruzan at C0, and I will cover that in this video. This is a guide. My Faruzan is currently still C0, and there's ways to play around it. But the main problem is, number one, how much energy recharge you need, which is ungodly. Genuinely, 250 to 300 is so much that you're not really building damage. Like, it's really hard to deal damage when you need that much energy recharge. But also, the biggest problem I have with this character is how dependent she is on her C6, or at least the jump in quality of the character from C0 to C6. Again, I don't normally call characters constellation dependent like ever, especially in a gacha game that can be dangerous, because I don't want to encourage people to spend more than they want to, which is why I'm also saying like you can play her C0. I do, and I think it's fine, but the character becomes completely different at C6, like genuinely a whole new character that is way better. In fact, well, even without constellations, she will buff your Nemo damage. C6 takes this up a notch. This constellation has many different effects, and honestly, the more I got to read it and also test it on the media server, as I mentioned earlier, the better I actually realized it is. What this constellation does is increase the crit damage of your anemo damage by 40%. This means that for a character like Wander or Shao, you pretty much just gain a free 40% crit damage, which is really good and somewhat comparable to Sara's 6th constellation. What is different from Sara's 6th constellation and why I don't necessarily have a problem with Sara, but I do with Faruzan, is the fact that every other constellation that Sara has, like her C2 and just other quality of lives, are all bundled up into one constellation. In fact, you're not just gaining crit damage, you're also gaining energy and a much better form of grouping. In fact, when you have Faruzan C6, and I'll play some footage of it on screen now, every 3 seconds throughout its duration, you're going to proc the effect of a fully charged aim shot after using your elemental skill, which is the thing that you shoot on the ground and then you get energy and that small amount of grouping. In fact, since this happens every 3 seconds and you don't have to charge up a shot, which is very annoying and a waste of DPS, you are getting passive anemo energy for your Faruzan, but also your anemo DPS like Shao or Skara, while also, if that wasn't enough, grouping enemies way better than before. Again, you don't have to charge shot to group these enemies, and the grouping won't undo itself by the time you swap out and get ready to DPS because you're already on your DPS character, since you just needed to use your burst and not your skill. And so just through this one constellation that has 3 parts that are all amazing, I can't stress enough how she literally transforms into a different character that just becomes much better, especially when you add this up to other constellations like her second one, which makes her burst have effectively 100% uptime in most teams. It gives you 6 more seconds on your burst duration, which I believe has, a 12-second duration, 20-second cooldown, so only 2 seconds of downtime, which is really good. And also the bonuses you gain have an additional duration, so yeah, it's 100% uptime from this ability once you do have your second constellation. And so yeah, C2 is good, and C2 can be okay stopping point, I guess, but if you only have C2, you still need an ungodly amount of energy recharge, you can't group characters efficiently, and you just lose out on a lot that C6 does have to offer. And so C2 is honestly pretty decent, but obviously C6 is on another level. Now, another issue with this as well is that she's a rate up 4-star that just came out and who's rate up on Skara's banner and who probably won't be featured on another banner for a while, which means not many people will have her 6th constellation. So it's hard to evaluate like her place in the meta or even Scaramouche's place in the meta, because it really does depend on if you have Faruzan C0 or C6. Now, I do want to apologize if this section seemed rambly. I'm just like actually kind of passionate about this because it's really annoying that a lot of her potential is locked behind C6, or at least a lot of the quality of life. Like, again, I want to keep repeating this so people aren't mischaracterizing what I'm saying. I still think she's okay at C0. Like, genuinely, part of what's annoying is that, yeah, she's also pretty good at C0. It's just you need like almost 300 or sometimes even more than 300 energy recharge, and I'm not exaggerating, or a team of 3 or 4 anemo characters with a ton of Favonius weapons, and you need to charge shot on her and make sure everything works out perfectly just to get a decent amount of value. So I still use her at C0, and yeah, I still recommend her as a decent but replaceable option for a C0 Wanderer, or potentially even Shao, but her battery skills are lacking. Whereas at C6, she turns into a amazing, like honestly, I'd argue broken character for those specific anemo teams that really want grouping, energy, and anemo damage bonus and resistance shred, which anemo carries want. Because of that, I both love and hate this character. I want to explain that sort of dilemma where I really like her and I like her idea and I want to use her with Wander and Shao, and I will continue to do so, but I just think what they did with her C6 is tragic, and I see a lot of people clickbaiting Faruzan being broken, and I'm not blaming anyone in particular. I don't care. Like, people can do whatever they want. My point is just I'm worried that people might be really hyping this character at C6 and then a bunch of people end up just swiping for it, which I also think is part of the design behind the constellations of this character, and I just think it's annoying, so I wanted to talk about it. Anyways, to recap, C0 is fine, but a ton of problems like energy and clunkiness, and then C6 becomes an amazing character, so I am also guilty of hyping up this character at C6, but I'm doing it in like a sad and annoyed way because I wish it wasn't the case. But anyways, those are just like my base thoughts on Faruzan and her kit and character as a whole, and why I think her place in the meta and also like Wander's place in the meta is very polarizing depending on what you have and like how much you pulled. Lastly, before moving on, I do want to re-emphasize that Faruzan C2 is honestly pretty decent. It makes your uptime 100%, and I wanted to at least address that in this video. It is a nice quality of life upgrade that makes her better than C0, but I still don't think it's enough to address any of the problems I mentioned earlier that are solved with your C6. And also C2, as I mentioned, is part of your C6. Like, when you have C6, you also have C2, which makes a fully constellated Faruzan that much better than a C0 Faruzan with just her base kit. All right, now moving on, let's actually talk about how to build your Faruzan. While I was debating making this into a separate video, I think it's good for me to include all of my thoughts on this character, as well as my thoughts on the best way to build her, how to get the most value out of your kit, into one complete video. Because of that, let's start by talking about the artifacts you want. While I normally talk about artifact sets first, I'm going to start by talking about stats, because since, as we saw earlier in the video, Faruzan, especially at C0, needs so much energy recharge, you want to make sure that you have enough energy recharge on the set that you're running on her, as if not, you won't get much value, and there's no point in running a good set anyways if you just can't use your burst and can't get value from the character. Because of that, starting with stats, here's what you want to go. At C0, I highly recommend going for energy recharge on every single piece. This means going energy recharge as a main stat on the sands and then as a substat on every single other piece that you can. The only exception here is for your circlet. If you can go for a crit rate, that is usually going to be favored, as on Faruzan, there's a high chance that you're going to be running the Favonius Warbow, which I'll talk about in the next section when we cover weapons, which is a bow whose effect will give you energy when you do crit. So having crit rate on your substats and your circlet is also going to be relevant. Generally speaking though, while crit rate is nice, your main focus is energy recharge, and so you definitely want that in your sands and on any substat that you can get it on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at C0 you want around 250 to 300 and sometimes even more energy recharge, depending on many factors like how often you're using your skill, if you have 2 or 3 Anemo characters in your team, and if your other support characters are running Favonius weapons. Sometimes you can get away with less energy recharge, I know, sometimes you might need more, but generally just go as much as you can, as honestly, if you have to go for over 250 to 300 anyways, the little bit of damage that you will be investing in like attack or crit at C0 usually isn't worth it because it is a pretty marginal DPS increase anyways. This changes at C6, but before we get into that, when I say energy recharge on every piece, I really do mean it. Like, while going Anemo damage bonus on your goblet is going to be optimal, and so I would recommend going ER sands, Anemo goblet, and crit rate circlet with ER substats. If you don't have an Anemo goblet with energy recharge, then yeah, you could go attack percent, or you could do what I do, which is filter by energy recharge and then pick literally the highest one, which for me, I'm using an onset one, which is hydro damage, and just go with that. Now, obviously to like test their damage and stuff, I've used Anemo damage bonus, but I genuinely recommend going for a goblet that has energy recharge, even if the main stat is irrelevant to you, because at C0, you're using her to buff your damage, not to deal damage. With that said, her burst scaling is decent, so if you are C6, you can start to focus on her damage a bit more and go for more offensive stats, like obviously still a Anemo damage goblet, a crit circlet, and then looking for crit rate, crit damage, and attack percent on all of your pieces. Your sands will probably still be energy recharge, but if you have enough, you can also go for attack percent, as that will be relevant and better than elemental mastery, as you're mainly focused on your bursts, big scaling, and the bonus damage from your elemental skill. If you're wondering the energy recharge you need at C6, while the exact number still varies, it does seem to be around 200%, depending on your team and your rotations. Because of that, you still will always need a lot of energy recharge, but a lot less at C6, it becomes a lot more manageable. Now, moving on in terms of the artifact sets you want, here's how you're going to build your Faruzan. If you're running an elemental damage dealer in your team, off-field supports like Fischl, Xingqiu, Rosaria, characters like that who can deal a lot of good damage even without being the main DPS, then you want to go for the 4-piece Verdessive Venerer, as it will greatly increase your team's damage. With that said, some Wanderer or Shao teams may not run an elemental support. They may run someone like Zhongli or Bennett or more passive buffing supports, to where you may not need the Verdessive Venerer set. If you don't need it, or if you have it on another character, other good sets are the following. First of all, 4-piece Noblesse Oblige can be great to buff your team's attack percent if you're not running Noblesse on another support, like potentially Bennett or another healer you may be running. Also, another set worth mentioning is the Tenacity of the Millith set, but only if you're C6, as the 4-piece set effect will proc even from off-field when your skill hits an opponent, which at C0 won't do that much, but at C6, since your burst procs the effect from your skill every 3 seconds, you will constantly be buffing the attack percent of your party members by 20%, making it a really good set when you're fully constellated. And so because of that, those are the 3 main support sets that I can recommend depending on the situation. Now, if you do need more energy recharge though, the sets like Emblem, either 2 or 4-piece, or Exile, once again, either 2-piece with Emblem or even 4-piece despite it being a 4-star artifact set, which gives you less stats, can both be relevant to increasing your energy recharge if you don't have enough. While your main concern with Faruzan is buffing your party members, which is why I typically recommend a more supportive artifact set, if you do need energy recharge from the 2-piece and also want to buff your Faruzan's personal damage, then going for Emblem is not a bad idea. It's something that you can also do, but it's generally just not my favorite. However, since you need so much energy recharge, I would recommend picking your set based on your stats, making sure you can actually use her efficiently before you commit to a set. Generally speaking though, I do recommend Verdessive Venerer, as it allows you to run elemental supports on your team without having to put Verdessive Venerer on another Anemo character like your DPS. Lastly, I want to mention that for Emblem and also mix and matching 2-piece sets like Verdessive Venerer with an attack percent set become even more relevant at C6 if you can manage your energy generation and want to focus on your Faruzan's personal damage, although once again, I do recommend supportive sets generally speaking. Next up, for the weapons you want on Faruzan, it is very straightforward. She's a character who wants energy recharge primarily, so going for an energy recharge weapon is going to be ideal. Now, while base attack does matter for your passive talent, this is only a small buff in the grand scheme of things, as you also have other buffs on your burst, to where I wouldn't pick a weapon solely based on your base attack like I would with someone like Bennett or sometimes even Sara. For Faruzan specifically, I still, especially at C0, highly recommend going for an energy recharge weapon like the Favonius Warbow or the Elegy for the end, which are my 2 favorites. Elegy, when it's level 90, does have a higher base attack than Favonius by quite a lot and gives you a lot of energy recharge, so it is quite nice. It also will increase your elemental mastery and the elemental mastery and attack percent of the active character when you proc its effect, so it can be the highest for your team's DPS, but it does give you a lot less effective energy to your Faruzan than the Favonius Warbow. Because of that, at C0, I still recommend Favonius over Elegy generally speaking, because it just gives you so much energy on its effect, giving you those white particles when you burst or or even just do a normal attack without having to charge shot, then I highly recommend it on Faruzan. It is my favorite weapon by far, but if you already have enough, then other weapons like Elegy for the End can be good and potentially better. Lastly, other ER weapons I wanted to mention are End of the Line, Sacrificial Bow, and technically Fading Twilight, which are all viable options, but again, Favonius Warbow or Elegy for the End are my two favorites. Moving on, if you have a C6 Faruzan, while energy recharge bows are still very good, if you have an energy recharge Sands and enough substats to have around like 200 energy recharge or to get your burst back on cooldown, then you can go for a more offensive bow if you want to maximize your Faruzan's damage. Again, at C6, it is up to debate as to what bow you want to go for. You can either go for energy recharge ones that are more supportive like Elegy or Fav, or more offensive ones with high base attack and a crit stat like the Skyward Harp, or any of the other 5-star crit bows, or even something like a high refinement Stringless, which despite its low base attack, which sucks, does give you a lot of burst and skill damage if you care about her personal damage. Now, again, it is a bit weird for me to split these sections to C0 and C6 as it is very different, but for most people, especially C0, but just in general, I do recommend going for a standard energy recharge bow to support your team and alleviate your energy recharge needs. Now, lastly, for Faruzan's teams, it is very straightforward. If you have an Anemo carry like Wanderer or Shao, you can use Faruzan with them, but with a few conditions, especially Shao, it's more weird, but with Wanderer, I think Wanderer Faruzan works well as a double Anemo pair, even at C0, genuinely, but it does get better at C2 with more uptime, or C6, it becomes way better. It can be used in pretty much any of the teams that I mentioned in my last guide, where I go into more detail on Wanderer's teams if you want more information. With that said, I do personally like triple Anemo to help Faruzan get energy at C0 and then double Anemo at C6, but obviously both work in different situations, and there's so many different teams here. Now, for Shao, if your Faruzan is not C6, you have to run triple Anemo or some other sources of energy generation, at least for your Shao personally, unless you run like a Fav Lance, because he really does need a lot of energy. If you don't have an Anemo battery like Sucrose, or even someone like Venti, Faruzan does not generate that much energy compared to some other Anemo characters like Sucrose with her first constellation, or even with a Sacrificial Fragments, to where I would not recommend running Faruzan Shao without another Anemo character, at least at C0 from my testing. Again, it's still early, my opinion on this may change, but from now it looks like if you're C6, this team becomes really relevant, and Faruzan Shao is a good pair, but at C0 it is very clunky unless you have another Anemo character like Sucrose, Venti, or I guess even Kazuha, Jean, whatever. Lastly, there's a case to be made for any other Anemo character. If you want to buff their personal Anemo damage, you can pair them with Faruzan, but it is more niche than either a Shao team, especially at C6, or a Wanderer team. And so overall, those are my thoughts on Faruzan. This video is quite unique and one that I would typically split into two separate videos, one commenting on her power level and the other a guide, but I figured I might as well give you everything you need to know in one video, especially because it's coming out a bit later than I wanted to. I don't want to make two videos on it and just give you guys all of my thoughts in one complete video. With that said, I personally do like Faruzan. I don't like how she's C6 dependent. At least a lot of her value is, even if she's fine at C0. I still used her a lot, even without constellations, and it worked, but it was very annoying to get her burst back. And now I actually unlocked her 6th constellation, where I'm getting a ton of value with my Anemo carries. With that said, I hope this guide was helpful, and if there's anything new on add, it will be in a pinned comment. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on Faruzan and on this type of video in particular. What do you guys think about the character with and without constellations? With that said, I hope this guide was helpful, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.